Thank you very much for accepting our invitations. We are here to discuss the events in Iran and the regional repercussions of those events. Most people are aware that the demonstrations have now gone past 110 days. There has been 4 executions and hundreds have died in the demonstrations. I know that some people in the Iranian left have described this as a revolutionary situation. I hesitate to do this for various reasons. The protests are continuing. Yesterday, the 8th of January, we saw major demonstrations in most Iranian cities. However, they are much more sporadic. Repression is taking its toll. The threat of executions is very serious. Internet communication is hampered. And as a result of all this, we are seeing protests that follow a particular event, such as the anniversary of the downing of Ukrainian airlines that carried many Iranians 3 years ago. We see demonstrations on the 40th day after the death of people who've been killed in the protest. The government is facing a crisis. I don't think anyone can doubt that. Forget about the reformist faction, the conservative factions of the Islamic Republic are now talking of the need for fundamental reform. However, we are not seeing what I would call conflict within the security forces. We are not seeing any forms of rebellion within either the army or the Revolutionary Guard. We are not at that stage yet. The workers' protests are important, and I think they are gaining momentum in Iran, but they are still in the initial stages of the protests. We are in the initial stages of those protests. Under these circumstances, I think it's important to discuss a number of issues. We will start, I think, with the regional context, and this is important because obviously there is a new government in Israel. It's a government that, at least in terms of its rhetoric, seems very adamant to show its adversary nature to Iran's Islamic Republic. On the one hand, many conservatives in the Iranian regime are hoping that a war, maybe with Israel, but maybe with somebody else, will save them. In some ways, it will be a God gift. They couldn't hope for anything better than that. So I'm starting by asking Moshe Machover to talk about the regional context and this potential threat of war, or the war of words, the Cold War that has gone on between Iran and Israel. And then I will ask Mike Macnair to talk about what I see as the illusions of the Iranian left, maybe even inside Iran, because I've personally given up hope about the exile left, but even inside Iran, in terms of where these protests can go without any organization, without plan, without strategy. So let us start with Moshe. Thanks again for accepting our invitation, and I hope to hear from you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the policies and the dangers of the new Israeli government that has just been formed at the very end of 2022, just before the new year. I'm going to start with aspects that seem not directly connected to the regional dangers that this new government poses, but just to give it a context. This new government is more right-wing, more represents a big reactionary and dangerous escalation in each and every dimension of Israeli politics, which are interconnected. I will start in ascending order of importance and severity, and I will get to the regional dangers towards the end of my contribution. So in ascending order of severity, the new government, first of all, represents a major shift towards neoliberalism. This, in the discussion in the media about the new Israeli government, this has not been mentioned, but it is true that the new finance minister is committed to a very extreme version of neoliberalism, which he connects with religious beliefs. He is the head of the so-called religious Zionism faction, Bezalel Smotrich, and apart from all his other nice qualities, he's a devout follower of the most extreme neoliberalism. So this is number one. Of course, all the aspects that I'm going to mention are interconnected. The next aspect in which there is a big shift represented by this government is towards theocracy. Paradoxically or ironically, in this, Israel, in some respect, is becoming a little bit more like Iran. The difference, of course, with the specific religion that is being imposed, but in general outline, all theocracies share a common feature. I think it is also interesting to add that the kind of religion represented now by a big part of the new government, specifically the one that is represented by the same person, Bezalel Smotrich, that I mentioned, is a messianic kind of theocracy. And I think this also may have echoes in the messianic beliefs of some of the religious leaders of the Islamic Republic. Just to give examples of what is in store for us under this new government, a greater push towards gender segregation in various forms, including universities. Homophobia. Just to give you a minor example, as you may or may not know, Israeli Railways doesn't run on Saturdays. Public transport in general over the whole country doesn't run on Saturdays for religious reasons, because this is supposed to be a day of rest, as it were. So you can't travel to have a picnic on the. But now the new religious fanatics in the Israeli cabinet, oh yeah, so when do they use the Saturday in order to make repairs in the line? If they need to do repairs and maintenance, they do it on Saturdays. So now the new religious fanatics in the Israeli cabinet demand that this shouldn't be done on Saturdays, because you mustn't do any work on Saturday. So they are pushing, this theocracy is pushing towards really downgrading of the operation of the Israeli railway system, because the repairs will have to be done on weekdays, while the line doesn't operate at all on Saturdays. Another illustration of the extreme theocratic tendencies of the new government is a move which may or may not succeed, but they are trying to push it through the Knesset, and that is to amend the Israeli law of return. The Israeli law of return is a racist law which gives Jews exclusive right to immigrate to Israel and immediately, automatically get Israeli citizenship. Now, in order to make it possible for Jews who have spouses and children who are not themselves Jewish, and this is quite common, especially in the United States and other countries, the law of return allows a Jew who immigrates to Israel under the law of return to bring with them spouses, children, and grandchildren. Now, of course, these religious fanatics who are now in the Israeli cabinet say, well, oh, wait a moment, these grandchildren are not proper Jews. They will dilute the ethnic purity of the Jewish state. So they want to curtail the law of return and to exclude grandchildren of Jews from having the right to immigrate to Israel under the law of return. So here there is a point of conflict between religious Zionists who are following the rabbinical law about the purity of the Jewish race, as it were, and the less religious Zionists who are more concerned to bring over to Israel as many Jews, even if they're not, proper Jews according to the rabbinical law. So this is another aspect in which we have a move towards a reaction and regression in Israeli politics. The next aspect in, let's say, in order of importance is racism against the Palestinians inside Israel, the Palestinians who are citizens of the Israeli state. Israel, as it is now, even under the previous government, is an extreme racist country. There is extreme racist discrimination against Palestinian citizens. Little of this is, some of it is enshrined in law. For example, the law of return itself is a racist law. It discriminates. And similarly, the laws of citizenship, etc., are racist. But relatively little of the racism is enshrined explicitly in law. Some of it is. On the other hand, there is no law in Israel against racism. Most self-styled liberal countries have legislation forbidding racism. In Israel, there is no law that penalizes racism, with one exception, which the new government is now set to repeal. This exception is in the fundamental law or the basic law concerning the Knesset. As you may know, Israel has no constitution, but it has a series, about a dozen or so basic laws which have the force of being, as it were, elements of a future constitution. So they have the standing of constitutional elements of a constitution without actually being part of a properly formulated constitution. The law, the basic law, this basic law about the Knesset in existence disqualifies any candidate for various on the various criteria, and one of the criteria is, let me quote, yeah, that's I think in paragraph 7 of the basic law on the Knesset, a candidate cannot run, may be disqualified if they make racist propaganda. Well, in so many words. That is to say, you can disqualify a candidate if it is found that they advocate racism. This is the only law in Israel, in Israeli legislation, that is concerned with racism. Now, the present government, and especially one of the ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir, whom I will mention later, wants to repeal this paragraph in the basic law on the Knesset. You may be surprised to learn that he himself was in the past disqualified under this under this paragraph of the Israeli basic law. In fact, Itamar Ben-Gvir is a follower of Meir Kahane, who himself was elected to the Knesset and was found to be so overtly racist that the then Israeli government, this was in the 1980s, couldn't really accept this, and they legislated the said law about the Knesset in order to exclude him, Meir Kahane. Ben-Gvir is a follower, was a member of the Kahane's party, and was himself disqualified subsequently from running to the Knesset under this law. So no wonder he is very keen to repeal this part of the fundamental law. Okay. Now, in increasing order of importance and danger, the policies of colonization of Palestinian lands is being turbocharged. It has been escalating until now, but this government is going to raise it to a higher level. What is involved in this? There are three ways in which this colonial or oppressive policy is going to be expressed. We can learn from the past. It's just going to escalate what is already happening. But according to their rhetoric and according to their very firmly held beliefs, they are going to move it to a new level. Number one is robbery of land, water, and other resources. And I'm talking about not just plain robbery, it's armed robbery, because this robbery of land, water, and various resources, including dwellings and so on, is secured, is accompanied by under the protection of Israeli armed forces. Okay, so it's not just a question of a few fanatic settlers who do what they like, but they are doing what they like under the protection and with the help of Israeli armed forces. In this connection, it is important to mention that in the new government, Bezalel Smotrich, the Messianic Zionist, is given control over all civil matters in the occupied territories. He's actually being given control of the so-called civil administration. The running of the occupied territories by Israel is divided into two sections. Civil matters are handled by the so-called civil administration, which is not a civilian organization. It is presently under the control of the army, but it's the section of the Israeli occupying authorities that is concerned with civil matters. And then there are directly military matters. Now, Bezalel Smotrich has been given control over the civil administration. So he is going to decide what territory, what area can be stolen from its Palestinian owners. And Ben Gvir, whom I mentioned also before, has been given control over the military aspect of that is to say, over the various police forces that are in charge in the occupied territories. First of all, the border guards, which are a sort of gendarmerie concerned with in policing the Palestinian population, and also various other armed organizations which had a rather innocent name. For example, the Nature Reserve Authority. Nature Reserve Authority is supposed to protect natural ecology. But of course, this is used in order to take, first of all, land from Palestinian farmers, turn it into a nature reserve, and then give it over to Israeli settlers. Okay, this is one form of repression and control over the Palestinian occupied territory. The second form is violent raids into the West Bank by the Israeli forces, including the formerly mentioned border guards, who allegedly are trying to arrest suspects. They come in big forces with armored vehicles, etc., into Palestinian towns and villages with the alleged or declared aim of trying to arrest people whom they suspect of plotting something. In the course of doing this, a lot of people get killed, and including many people who are not suspected of anything, just bystanders, because of the extreme violence that is being applied. Just today, I read a typical incident. A worker in the occupied, on one of the roads in the occupied territories, who was employed in tarring a road. He was, doing some maintenance work on the road. While he was doing it, a big convoy of Israeli border guards was passing by, and he got out of his car, parked the car on the side to just look at the convoy, what is going by, and trying not to stand in its way, smoking a cigarette peacefully. Then a door opens from one of the vehicles in the gendarmerie convoy, and a guy throws a stun grenade at this guy, hitting him in the head and causing the worker to lose his left eye. This has been actually recorded. You can see it on a video, because the brother of the same worker was actually sitting in the car while he was smoking. His brother was in the car taking a video. So the whole thing was documented. Of course, the Israeli forces reply to this was that the victim was engaged in some kind of stone throwing or what, but you can see in the video that he was just standing there peacefully smoking. This is a typical incident. Finally, the third way in which escalation is going to occur in the occupied territories is religious provocation. And here I'm talking about the holy places, especially the Haram al-Sharif, the mountain on which the Mosque of Al-Aqsa is situated. This is a sure source of provocation. Not for nothing, these new fanatics in the Israeli cabinet have been dubbed incendiaries. They are dubbed pyromaniacs. These people are out to make deliberate provocation calculated to increase tension and increase conflict in the occupied territories and beyond. Because I don't need to tell you that a big provocation on Temple Mount is going to have repercussions not only in Palestine, but in the entire Muslim world. And here is a possible point of ignition of a conflict which is going to go beyond the confines of Israel-Palestine. This added to the inevitable increasing resistance of the people Palestinian people in the occupied territories who are subject to the kind of land robbery and military provocation that I described before, is going to lead inevitably to increasing escalation. These religious fanatics who are now in control of the Israeli government don't want to avoid it. In fact, they want to provoke it. Their messianic frame of mind actually leads them to believe that this is the way to get, I mean, the Jewish equivalent of the apocalypse, leading to a big conflagration, which will allow them to, first of all, implement a new Nakba, get under the smoke screen, under the tension of a big regional conflagration, get rid of millions of Palestinians, drive them across the Jordan into what is now the Kingdom of Jordan, and if possible, they are hoping for the destruction of the Islamic holy site on Haram al-Sharif and rebuilding the Jewish temple that was destroyed by the Romans a couple of thousand years ago. This is actually, I mean, it sounds like a horror movie, but these people are thinking in these terms. The danger is, of course, to create a regional war. We know, I'm going to end my talk just pointing out that we know that as things are now under the previous Israeli government, there has been a constant low-level hostilities between Israel and Iran. Israel calls it the war between wars, which consists of hitting ships of Iranian-owned ships are hit by Israel, assassinations, and some retaliation similar operations by the Islamic Republic against Israel. This is a low-level kind of war. Israel cannot start a war and cannot conduct a war against Iran on its own. It needs American support, but it is quite capable, and the new government is quite capable of trying to ignite a situation in the area in which the United States will be carried into a war against Iran. Especially, they are hoping for the return in the near future of a more right-wing administration in the United States, which will smooth their path towards an attack on Iran. So, I mean, a regional war can happen either by design or even by accident as a result of moves by these fanatics that without actually calculating it's simply that they are irresponsible and they don't care. It's not necessarily that they are going to plan a war. They may do, but it's not the only way in which war can break out. It can break out as a result of a chain of escalation, starting with provocations. Obviously, you know, the Israeli policy planners have long had plans about Iran. I mean, they certainly don't care about human rights in Iran. In fact, they are moving in the area of human rights. They are moving towards convergence with the Islamic Republic. But what they want is to get out of the way a rival for importance, for hegemony in the Middle East. Israel is looking to assert its local hegemony as a subcontractor of American global hegemony. Israel is the local subcontractor in the region. Iran is standing in its way for obvious reasons. Ideally, some Israeli strategists have looked for the dismemberment of Iran. Iran, I needn't tell you, is not ethnically homogeneous, and Israeli strategists have been talking about the ideal solution would be to actually break Iran up. What I can predict, and what one can predict with certainty, is that any Israeli-American intervention in Iran is going to end very badly for the Iranian people. This is the lesson that we can learn from all US interventions in the recent decades, starting from Afghanistan, then Iraq, Syria, Libya, etc. Wherever they have intervened, and in most cases it was under the pretext of protecting and defending human rights. They ended up in creating a chaotic situation where human rights are less respected than they had been before. I mean, the case of Afghanistan is a lesson to us all.
Thanks very much. Before I ask Mike to make a contribution, I was going to ask you just one question. I was reading that buses in Israel are now imposing policy of gender segregation. And in Iran, of course, there were those, and some of it was demolished by people just walking, not accepting it. There were segregations in university canteens, and that was challenged and destroyed even during the last 100 and few days. isn't there, I mean, do ordinary young Israelis not feel the kind of religious intervention in their private lives is going to be disastrous? And don't they look at Iran and see how terrible it was that religion was dictating aspects of life that should be taken as being private sector?
First of all, I must correct you. It is not that all public transport buses are segregated. It depends on the line, it depends on the locality. In lines which are mainly used by religious settlements, some of the religious men insist on women sitting in the back of the bus. But of course, in Tel Aviv, this would be unheard of and undreamed of. It may come to this, but it is not practiced there. It is practiced in individual cases, and there have been cases where the driver refused to take on board a woman who was not properly dressed. Right? Her skirt was too short or whatever. These things have happened, but they are localized. And of course, this is the problem that answers, the second part of your remark. The secular part of a Jewish Israeli society, and by the way, the majority of Israelis are not religious Jews. First of all, the 20% Palestinian citizens are not Jews at all. They may be religious in Islam or Christianity, but they don't follow religious Judaism. And among Jews, also a very big proportion are secular. They don't follow this. So the population is really divided. These restrictions and various acts against motivated by homophobia and misogynism and so on, are resented by a big part of the Israeli population. It is not as if the population is united behind this. The present government has a majority in the Knesset, but it by no means has a big majority in the general population.
Thanks very much, Moshe. Mike, if you have any comments or questions.
Just a quick, to Moshe's point about breaking up Iran along ethnic lines. I think it's important to be aware that even if Iran was ethnically homogenous, the United States would find reasons to suppose that there was a non-homogenous. So, for example, the United States insisted, I'd just been reading about this in this context, on Austria being separated, German Austria being separated from Germany in 1918, 19, 20, 21, on the basis that, well, what justification they offered for that is very unclear, but it was just an insistence of the United States that should be the case. The American South claimed to have an ethnic difference from the American North, when the real difference was simply that they wanted to maintain the institution of slavery. And in recent years, there was an insurrection in Bolivia of the lowlanders against the highlanders, which was claimed to be an ethnic difference that the highlanders were oppressing by having voted for the first time a Highlander government, that the highlanders were oppressing the landlord class of the lowlanders. So this sort of the process of construction of ethnicities for political advantage, it seems to me is something which it's important to be aware of as part of the background. That the policy of the United States, of course, is that there should not be large states. That states in general should be small states, which therefore can't stand up to the United States.
Yeah, yes, I would add that, of course, yes, I agree. But if you are looking to divide a big state into smaller bits, it is useful to look for pre-existing lines of division, and ethnic or national or ethnic division is a possible pre-existing line. You know, like in toilet paper, there's an already existing perforation which enables you to turn bits into sort of useful sizes.
I would just add that just as a point of fact, it's very true that both Israel and Saudi Arabia have done their best over the last 3 months to increase divisions within Iran's national and ethnic minorities. But it hasn't, so far it hasn't worked. This doesn't mean that there is a plan that will work. I'm not saying it will forever be like this. But currently, as some Iranian left-wing websites have been pointing out inside the country, we seem to be in a post-nationalist, post-ethnic era, in that the protest in Kurdistan is supported by Baluchistan. Baluchistan gives slogans about Azerbaijan region. There seems to be a sense of solidarity. Now that can break, and the dangers about the whole, the number of alternatives that the US is proposing for Iran in terms of right-wing, some royalists, some ex-Mujahideen, current Mujahideen, all sorts of alternatives being considered by the US can increase those national and ethnic tensions. I'm not denying that. All I'm saying is that right now, that plan hasn't worked. Before I ask Mike, I just want to make a couple of comments, and that is about the Iranian left. Now, both inside Iran, but also outside Iran, there have been many defeats for the Iranian left. I don't think I need to explain all of them. They are clear to most people. There seems to be a phobia about issues such as organization, parties, political parties, parties of the left, communism, socialism. So we are facing a situation where people are talking of protests being spontaneous, celebrating that, some of which I would celebrate as well, because at least it's not led by the right wing. But this spontaneity, according to some people, will automatically lead to a revolutionary alternative. And the way they look at this is to talk of councils, workers' councils, employees' councils. All this will evolve almost automatically into a form of revolutionary alternative. I was reading something in an Iranian paper this morning, and I noticed that they talk of Islamic councils, Shura Islamic Council. So it is amazing that the Iranian left, in this obsession, this phobia against anything that is Marxist, organizational, party-orientated, is happy to just talk of councils without remembering the history of 44 years ago, which led to the setting up of reactionary councils. So I would like to address this and the concept of the unity of Iranian left, which again, there seems to be a phobia about political unity. There have been many failures, but that doesn't justify it. So thanks, Mike.
Okay, I'm going to talk exactly about this issue of councils and the party question. And so I'm actually, although as Yasamine's pointed out, there were Shoras in the revolution of 1979 and immediately afterwards. That did not lead to an upshot which was in the interests of the working class as a whole. I'm going to talk a little bit about other examples and therefore what the underlying logic of the issue is. I should say that there's an alternative line, which is the line of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, and I'm not sure whether other organizations have it as well, which is that what has to be done now is to fight for bourgeois democracy, because the workers' movement is too weak, and therefore what has to be done is to fight for bourgeois democracy, which essentially means that they come in behind the policy of the American government. But of course, what you get if you come in behind the policy of the American government is not bourgeois democracy, as Iraq demonstrates and Libya demonstrates. What you get is Somalification. I think, I'm not even sure that Somalia, I think possibly Lebanon was the first country to be subjected to this sort of humanitarian intervention, which produces nothing but failed state paralysis and destruction of infrastructure and destruction of human rights insofar as they exist. But it's been the policy of the United States since it failed to impose order in Vietnam. It failed to maintain order in Vietnam. The United States has pursued the policy of simply inflicting destruction. It always represents itself as that it's going to create democracy, liberty, human rights, humanitarian intervention. Not novelty, of course. The Romans invaded Britain on the basis that this was a humanitarian intervention to stop human sacrifice. The Spanish used the same justification for their colonial conquests of Mexico and Peru. But none of it, what the United States says now, is not to be believed any more than what the Romans said in 43 AD, or what the Spanish government, Spanish propagandists said in the 1500s. The idea that councils is the solution and we don't need to worry about the party question is a very common idea of the far left. It's not just the Iranian far left, it's across the board. And when people talk about the party, as often as not, what they mean is not a party in the sense in which the parties of the Second International and the Bolshevik Party, the big socialist parties, meant, but a quite general staff of revolution, which is a little group, the little cog which drives the large wheel, which is the councils, which drives the masses. It's a common far left view which comes out of people reading State and Revolution in the cheap Beijing or Moscow editions, which were in circulation in the 1960s. It's a very substantial misreading of State and Revolution because it just misunderstands what the Bolshevik Party was, fails to recognize that the Bolshevik Party at the time of the revolution of February 1917, although held down by repression, had been the majority party of the Russian working class, the party which won all the working class constituencies, which put out a daily newspaper in the circulation of tens of thousands in Petrograd under conditions of illegality, though ones where there was a degree of liberty. I have written about this in an article in the Weekly Worker in November 2004, and a bit more generally in this little book, Revolutionary Strategy, in chapter 2. I give a couple of other examples, and one of which is sort of unusually surprising. Germany. In Germany, the revolution of 1918-19 led to the creation of workers' councils all across Germany, on very large scale indeed, very extensive. And there were congresses of the workers' councils. But the right-wing social democracy were able to persuade the trade union militants who had been involved in it to ban political parties from these councils. And the effect of banning political parties was that the right-wing social democracy were able to control the councils by way of their presence in the trade union, among the trade union officials, who were, of course, not excluded. And also, in addition, there were councils set up of workers, soldiers' councils set up by army officers, and including the officers as well as the other ranks, which then were represented in the congresses of councils. So that the problem of having councils doesn't necessarily mean a positive outlook, which is the same as the Iranian 1979-80. You can have councils, but these councils can become an instrument of what becomes the Islamic Republic. Another very different one is Austria. In the same period, 1918-19, workers' councils and works factory committees set up all over urban Austria, urban and suburban and industrial Austria. But the problem which they confronted, and this is discussed in Otto Bauer's history of the Austrian Revolution, Otto Bauer was one of the participants. The revolution radically dislocated production. So the workers set up factory councils, and they come to the social democratic leadership, and they say to the social democratic leadership, okay, what should we be producing in these factories? The bourgeoisie, the capitalists have run away and shut the factory down. We've taken over the factory. What should we produce? How do we get coal to fire the steam engines to run the machinery? How do we locate? How do we intersect with the needs of the society? What relationship are we going to have with the peasantry, who are the people who are making food, the only people who are making how do we deal with this situation? Now, I don't think that the social democracy in Austria, I don't think had the degree of cynical, the social democratic leadership of Austria didn't have the degree of cynical manipulation of the right-wing social democracy in Germany, who allied with the far-right veterans organizations, the Stahlhelm, to suppress the left. But they were committed to peaceful road, and they were committed to remaining within national framework. And within that framework, they formed the judgment that the only thing which they could do was to get the councils to keep production going as far as they possibly could, but also to make deals with the Entente powers to get coal into the country and make concessions all across the board in order to, so that having the councils, it doesn't solve, the point is that having the councils doesn't solve practical problems which are posed as soon as you're in power. As soon as it's no longer the boss who's running the factory, you have to run the factory. And in order to run the factory, you need to make the relations with all the other bits of the social order. I give another example, which is from today's Times newspaper. So it's a conservative newspaper, and the essence of the matter is that the Conservative Party, in order to protect the interests of its contributors from squeezed the public expenditure in the bits which were easiest to squeeze. And the bits which were easiest to squeeze, this was in Cameron's administration in 2010, was the local authority budgets. Squeezing the local authority budgets, however, has the consequence that if people have been treated in hospital, they can't be discharged because there's no social care provision from the local authorities, because the squeeze on the local authority budgets has smashed the ability to provide local authorities' ability to provide social care for the elderly otherwise. And so the elderly, then we get bed blocking of the elderly in the hospitals, which the government's proposed solution, this is why the issue comes up, the government's proposed solution is to block book a whole load of hotel rooms to dump the elderly who are going to be discharged from hospital on the basis that their treatment is finished in order to free up hospital beds. The idea that this is it puts more money into the hands of contributors to the Conservative Party, because small hoteliers are a substantial part of the base of the Conservative Party. But the idea that it's cheaper than actually paying the local authorities sufficient to pay for home care for the elderly, what used to be called home helps for the elderly infirm in their homes, is just complete bollocks. Now, the Tory party, of course, is doing this because the underlying objective of the Tory party is to persuade the general public that we can't afford healthcare free at the point of use, but that healthcare needs to be rationed by access to money, and we need an American style system in order to do that. And so this is the latest stage of the Tory party, has pursued ever since 1945 a policy of causing less eligibility in the public sector services, starting with public sector housing, public sector education. By reducing the quality of public sector housing, public sector education, it's then possible to increase the willingness take up of private offerings from the middle classes, and thereby gradually we create the situation which in housing the Thatcher government simply destroyed, for all practical purposes, all forms of public sector housing other than provision for the very poor. But the problem is, how does the left respond to this sort of initiative of the Tory party? And in order to do that, the left needs to be able to think about how would we deal with the problem of social care of the infirm elderly and bed blocking in the NHS and the resources available to the NHS. We have to have our own proposals. Secondly, we have to have our own proposals in the context that our rulers set out to divide us along national lines. Our rulers set out to divide us by making us excited about Brexit, for example, of insistence that you must choose between the liberal position of backing the neoliberal economic institutions of the European Union, or alternatively backing British nationalism and Brexit. The working class movement, the working class as a class, needs, quote, poor men's guardians. This was the expression which was used of the press, the non-advertising funded press in the 19th century. It needs to reconstitute its own ability to speak. It needs to reconstitute its own ability to pursue a long-term agenda, and an agenda which can escape from the devil's choice between, on the one hand, we have to make an alliance with the nationalists, which of course a whole lot of the left at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in Iran said the Islamists are just nationalists. Well, yeah, they are nationalists, but they're nationalists of a right-wing and reactionary kind. You know? The Islamists are just nationalists, and so we have to ally with the Islamists against US imperialism. Or alternatively, the AWL's line, the Islamists are fascists, and we have to ally with the Democrats of the United States against the Islamists. By doing that, you're just tagged, pulled from one side to another by manipulations, and those manipulations are made possible by virtue of not of the long term. I said that the Tory party has engaged in a long-term policy beginning in the 1950s of undermining welfare provision. The state in Iran right now is engaging in a medium to long-term policy of trying to exhaust the protests, of keep stonewalling, perhaps offering a little bit of change, a degree of repression, keep, and then eventually it'll wind down. And eventually it'll wind down because there's a limit to the extent to which people can be constantly on strike. There's a limit to the extent to which people can be constantly on the street, especially in winter. There's a limit to the extent to which people can put up with the fact that mass action is disruptive. It does, revolution and so on, does disrupt ordinary production and make it hard for people to get food and resources and so on and so forth, unless the workers' movement takes over. And in order to take over, it needs to plan positively. But in order to be able to plan positively, it needs to organize in the long term, for the long term, not just to organize what grows out of the spontaneous movement. Because what grows out of the spontaneous movement, eventually either it gets manipulated out of existence, as was the case of the Shuras in 1979-80, or it's confronted with the need to make hard choices and is unable to make those sort of choices. It needs party organization. I don't mean party, quote, Leninist combat party concept, but it needs party organization in order for the activists should be thinking about all the questions, the policy in the round, and posing a positive alternative to the policy of the regime, and also thereby to create what we've never been able to create with little groups of one sort and another, to create a voice, even a clandestine, smuggled in, duplicated piece of paper, which can be a voice of a movement. That's it seems to me those are the fundamental issues. That's it.
Very much. I'm unmuting Moshe as well. Moshe, do you have any comments on this, or?
No, I just think, I want to reinforce this is a common anarchist or anarchoid illusion that you can run a society by purely localized decision making. This never worked. Certainly, it cannot work in a highly centralized modern economy. So I mean, councils do turn up, or tend to turn up as in the beginning of a revolutionary situation. But what happens next, if there is no structure for more global, more countrywide and beyond organization and planning, I mean, then it either peters out, as Mike said, or it gets taken over by somebody else.
I guess I would just add the point about planning, that it's worth flagging the Cockshott and others book, which Moshe has also flagged, about planning in conditions of global warming. If there's one thing which is, it seems to me now obvious, it's that we have to confront, to grasp the nettle of plans. That's there's a very strong tendency for the left to be phobic about planning as much as phobic about parties and phobic about national level and international level organization. But this phobia serves the interests of our rulers as they are now.
Can I add something to this, since Mike mentioned this modern work by Cockshott, Zachariah, and others? Marxists tended to be too blasé about the idea of the possibility of planning a modern economy. In the Engels' anti-Düring, he says, well, this will be a matter of simple calculation. You just, he says somewhere, I don't remember the exact location, but you can find it. You just work out how much labor is needed to do this, that, and the other. If you look into it, this is an enormously complicated issue, because you need to work out not only the labor needed for direct production of a given item, let's say a microchip or a pound of sugar or whatever. You need also to factor in all the labor necessary for the inputs. If you look at it carefully, it is a tremendously complicated mathematical problem. And the Gosplan, the planning authority of the early Soviet Union, was confronted with this, and they couldn't solve it. They had more or less, some of them had more or less the abstract theory worked out, but they couldn't implement it because they didn't have the computing power to make the computation in real time and to make corrections that are necessary when things don't respond in the way you anticipated. It is only quite recently that the computing power for proper socialist planning have come into existence. And the work of Cockshott, Zachariah, and others points at how this can be implemented. They've worked out some of the bones of the theory. It is by no means a simple problem, and certainly localized decision making by local councils cannot possibly cope with it. You need in order to run a socialist economy that caters for need and not for profit, you need a democratic but centralized planning authority which uses the computation power of the most recent generation.
Thanks very much. Just one additional question, and I will stop after that. And that is the issue of unity and alliances, and in fact, the whole concept of agreements within a party. Again, I think the mistakes of the past have led the Iranian left to a situation where they seem to think that unless you agree on every detail of your politics, you can't even have an alliance, a party, or the whole concept of unity has become a very serious problem, an obstacle in some ways. And I wondered if you could briefly address that as well. I'm conscious that I've gone longer than I thought, but please go ahead and we'll finish with that.
Yeah, I think it's a delicate point, but I think that the fundamental point is you need a basic idea of where you're going, which is why I talked about this, the planning issue and the issue of working class, the politics of the working class as well is part of that. And you need that basic idea of where you're going. In order to organize, you need to set that out. You need to be able to have a group come together and set it out. It doesn't have to be enormously long. The Erfurt program of the German social democracy is in its original text about 4 or 5 pages long. The program of the Russian social democracy was rather longer, but still not enormously long. It's the ability to organize on the basis of the two elements, which is one is the maximum, our aim, what our end goal is, planning, production for need, and so on and so forth, and then the minimum, which is what are we prepared to, what's the minimum basis on which we'd be prepared to form a government. You need both of those elements, and that level you need agreement, but you don't need agreement on theory. Particularly, you don't need agreement on theory. You don't need agreement on whether the Soviet Union was state capitalist or a degenerated worker state, socialism with peculiar characteristics, or bureaucratic socialism, or whatever the hell formulation. And equally, you don't need agreement on tactic, and you don't need, you need agreement that you have some method which you decide how you will implement tactics. But equally, you need the acceptance that there will be open disagreement. And it's important, actually, because the open disagreement is the process by which the membership of the party learns and becomes able to be educated as opposed to just trained in parroting a particular line. Educated means you can manipulate the stuff yourself rather than just being able to, well, I know how to fit Speedo to a Morris Marina. I learned when I was young, and the muscle memory has never left me. But that's not the same as being able to manipulate to do engineering work or design or something like that. And that's the difference between education, party education, and party training. And education requires the acceptance, and the party unity requires the acceptance that it's unity in diversity, that it's unity on the basis of that there is going to be routinely disagreement. Disagreement is normal. That you live with disagreement, but within certain limits. I think it's obviously you can't be, well, how shall I put it? You can't be in a unified organization on the basis that in order to be in a unified organization, you have to shut up.
Or
you have
split.
to keep quiet, not talk about the war or whatever it may be.
Or split.
Or split.
Yeah, that it's that's the there is that limit to it, but the left, seems to me, is everybody's still thinking in terms of the idea that the People's Front, the basis of unity, is the monolithic party of 1921 of the left, and the People's Front, as far as the not of 1936, as far as people don't actually read the documents of 1921 or the documents of 1936, but they have the gut idea that the party has to be unified on the basis of a common tactic, and that this common monolithic appearance, that you shut up about differences, and then conversely, that in order to have unity more broadly in the movement, it has to be on terms that the left shuts up in order to get agreement with the right, so that the right has the veto over what can be said. That's very visible. Classical example of that is the Corbyn movement in the British Labour Party, which set out to, having had the curious luck to win the leadership of the Labour Party, set out to create unity with the right wing, which the right wing, of course, weren't going to shut up. But they expected that the left were going to shut themselves up for the sake of unity. And that, it seems to me, again, from reports from not only Yassamine, but also a lot of other comrades about the Iranian left. My impression is that the Iranian left has been doing that for the last 50 years. 50?
44.
44 years.
Or,
probably more, actually.
Earlier, yes, earlier. 50 is correct.
Yes.
That's it.
Thanks very much to both of you. We will put this online. It will, hopefully we will transcribe it as well. Once again, I'm very grateful for the time you've given, and I think it will be very useful for at least comrades I know who hopefully will contribute to this debate further. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.